Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome to the Pastor Study. My name is Dave and I'm delighted to have you with us today to dive in to the parables of Jesus. The Pastor Study exists to help you interpret Scripture, proclaim the gospel faithfully, and minister to God's people with love and care. We've begun a series on sort of a beginner's guide to the parables, and I felt a little badly last time as I left you sort of feeling a bit negative about perhaps about how you have understood the parables before or how you've interpreted them. And maybe you were left wondering, well, like, Dave, how do I actually then interpret the parables? And that's what this video, I hope, will accomplish. When I've taught the parables in the past, I have often said to students in my class that the box that they have constructed around the parables, like, I'm about to sort of blow it up a little bit, but then I'm going to help them rebuild it over the course of the semester. And that's sort of what that first video did. It sort of blew up the box. And this video is the beginning of trying to help you rebuild how you interpret the parables, what kinds of questions you ask of them, and what they mean, how you can then teach and preach them to those in your ministry context. It's great to be in this sort of outdoor study, but let's go down into my study, grab a cup of coffee, and let's dive in to the parables and how to interpret them rightly. Thanks for coming down into the study. I got my coffee here. And as I said, today we're going to highlight some recommended practices for reading the parables rightly. And the point with these practices is to keep us on the right path as we study the parables so that we don't go astray, so that we don't fall into some of those habits or patterns that I talked about in the previous video. Now, I do want to be clear about what these practices are not. They are not a step-by-step guide that if you follow them step by step, you will 100% for sure end up with the right interpretation. That's just not how studying the scriptures work. And so I want you to know that these are recommended practices, that some of which are going to be more important than others for a given parable. So it requires some wisdom, requires a lot of just reading and time in the text to know, okay, which of these practices is really important, or how many of them are, and which are not quite as important for this particular parable. So just keep that in mind as we are going through all of these steps. Now, I think there's about 11 of them. And again, there's no particular order to these, but I do think the first one, apart from prayer, which we'll come back to, the first one is really important, which is to just read and reread and reread the parable. Read it as many times as you can. Read it in multiple translations. If you know Greek, read it in the Greek. If you don't know Greek, no worries. Read it in, let's say the ESV, and then the NASB, and then, pick a different, New Living, or a variety of translations so you can just sort of see what's going on. You're just trying to imbibe of the text. You're trying to just drink deeply over and over again of the parable. And it's sort of like when I would recommend for preaching or leading a Bible study or teaching a Sunday school class, that if you're going to teach on a text, give yourself 4 or 5 days before you teach, and each day read the text, maybe a couple of times, so that over a period of time, you are sort of living in the world of the text as much as possible. Reading the text, reading the parable as much as you can is super important. The next step is to analyze the structure of the parable. And here, there are a couple ways you can approach this. You could look at it thematically. You could outline the text in a way that says, hey, the first half of the text, let's say the parable of the prodigal son. The first half is the younger son. The second half is the older son. And then break down the little subsections of each of those major sections. All of this helps to sort of figure out, okay, how do all of the sentences, how do all the sections, the subsections, how do they fit together? What is the parable trying to communicate? It can really illuminate a little bit, maybe what the main point of the text is, or main points, and it can eliminate what maybe we thought might be a main point, but really isn't the focus of the text. Doesn't mean it's not important, it just means it's not primary for what we should look at. Sometimes there's also for parables a statement before or after the parable that gives us insight into what the parable itself is about. I think of the parable of the unjust judge and the persistent widow in Luke 18. There's a sentence at the beginning, there's a sentence at the end, that both of which are a little bit different, but they give insight to what this parable is about. Another thing to consider is to assess where this parable occurs in the particular gospel that you're studying. In which gospel is it? Are we talking about Matthew, Mark, Luke? Okay, and then where in that gospel does the parable occur? What passages before or after? I call this the co-text, not context, but the co-text. What passages before and after the parable might help us get a sense of some of the things that the parable's about? It might help us see, why does Jesus have this parable on his mind and on his lips in this particular moment? Maybe you could ask the question, what is lost if you took this parable out? Remember that the Gospels are narratives, and they have a progression from beginning to conclusion, and so everything has to make sense in that narrative progression. And if you are thinking about, a parable and where it occurs in a particular gospel, if you ask the question, what's lost if you take it out, that might help illuminate a little bit more, a little bit further, what the parable is doing here in a particular gospel. You could also look at some repeated words or concepts in the parable. It's always important. Repetition is an important rhetorical device, both now and in the first century, and it helps the speaker sort of point his hearer toward what might be a main focus or emphasis. Now, the same is also true for what's not there. And even more than that is what's unique in the parable. If you find a word or a concept that hasn't occurred anywhere else in the gospel and doesn't occur after this parable, well, that could be a pointer to what Jesus wants us to hear. Doesn't necessarily mean it is, but it could be. What about the Old Testament? Are there any allusions or echoes or quotations from the Old Testament in and around this parable that you're studying? What might that particular Old Testament allusion or echo or quotation tell us? Not all parables have an explicit or even implicit connection to the Old Testament. So be careful not to read something into the parable from the Old Testament that isn't there. And even when you sort of think it's an echo, you still have to be cautious not to overread things into the parable. What kinds of key socio-historical elements in the parable are important for understanding what Jesus is communicating here in this parable? We don't need to get into all the details about, how historically accurate is this particular parable. We don't have to get into viniculture and viticulture and the parable of the wicked tenants to understand what Jesus is trying to communicate. But we do need to know some things about various practices. Let's say we need to know about Samaritans for the parable of the Good Samaritan, or financial and agricultural practices in the first century. All these kinds of things can really help you as you are studying a particular parable. Don't want to overstate things again, but you want to make sure to not understate or underemphasize what is in the text. One thing that is really important is, who is Jesus speaking this parable to? Always consider who are the intended hearers of Jesus' parables. For example, the parable of the prodigal son, if you just stick to Luke 15, 11 to 32, and you don't look anywhere else, you're not even going to know who is Jesus saying this parable to. You have to go back to chapter 15, verses 1 and 2 to see who the audience is. You need to know who the audience is when you're studying a parable. It's really important. Always ask, in addition, what are the rhetorical goals of this particular parable? What is the purpose for which Jesus is giving this parable? What is he trying to get them to hear? And why now? Why now in his ministry? Why also now in the particular gospel writer's account? This goes back a little bit to the narrative setting point, but all of this is trying to get at asking questions of the parable, of the text, that the parable itself is trying to get us to ask. We need to be cautious not to bring our own questions to the text too much and allow those questions to really override the questions that the parable itself, that Jesus is trying to get us to ask. What theology is important for this parable that we need to understand? Kingdom of God would be a prominent example. What do we need to know about the kingdom prior to the parable? And what is the parable itself trying to communicate about the kingdom? We need to make sure, though, that we don't try to make a parable say everything about everything. As I said in the previous video, parables do not give complete, whole theological systems. They focus on a particular theological point or aspect, but they don't talk about everything about theology. And so don't try to force them into saying too much. We also can, as we're studying the parables, look at other versions of this parable in a different gospel. Now, I've left this way down on the list because I don't want you to start here. I don't want you to harmonize from the beginning, because that means that you're not going to look at the narrative setting in a particular gospel. You're not going to deal with some of the other things we've already talked about. You got to be really cautious when you move from Luke's parable to Matthew's, or vice versa, or to Mark. If it occurs in all three gospels, you got to be really careful not to overstate anything that might be in one version but not in another. One other thing that you can do, and then we'll talk about the main thing I think that you need to do when you're studying the parables, is then after doing all of this work on your own, studying the text, reading it over and over again, all these things, you can then look at other resources that other Christians throughout the history of the church have produced. You can look at commentaries, you can look at articles if you can find them, you can look at different books. I have a couple links in the description. I have affiliate links there. I get a commission. It really helps the channel. If you want to check out them. If you're going to buy one book on the parables right now, I would suggest Klein Snodgrass's Stories with Intent. Make sure to get the second edition. And it's great. It's not perfect. There are things that I don't quite agree with at points, but in general, it's a great resource to have on your shelf if you're going to get one book. And if you're going to buy that book, please click the link, use the affiliate link there. It really does help out the channel. Lastly, the last thing, and really the first thing as well, is pray. Pray. Ask the Lord for guidance and help as you study His Word. Ask that the Spirit would illuminate your study of the text, that the Spirit would open your mind to consider what we really need to hear in this passage. Not just what we want to hear, not just the questions that we find interesting, but what is really there, what Jesus is really trying to communicate. Pray, pray, and pray. This leads us to approach the text with humility and sensitivity, rather than just in our own pride and arrogance, trying to quickly and easily understand what we think the text is trying to say. Again, parables, as I said in the previous video, studying them is really more art than science. I stole this from Michael Gorman's book on biblical exegesis. where he talks about the art of exegesis, link in the description. But the nature of parables themselves requires a bit of a more artful approach. There's not a scientific step-by-step way that we can get to them. We like that as modern thinkers. We like to have our, 5 steps to right interpretation. It doesn't really exist. So these recommended practices are designed to help you interpret the text well. As I said at the beginning, you might use some of these more than others as you're studying a parable. You might not use some of them at all if the parable doesn't really require it. It just depends on the specific parable that we're talking about and that you are studying. I hope this video helps you have more confidence in how to study the parables. If you missed the previous video, to check it out here. Go back and watch some of the things to avoid so that you don't misinterpret the parables. You might also check out some of the resources I mentioned, links in the description. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button. If you are interested in more content like this, hit the subscribe button. It really does help out the channel. Thanks for joining me today. May the Lord bless your study of His Word and your ministry. Until next time, in the Pastor Study.